I never thought betrayal would come wrapped in legal papers, delivered by my own son's hands on a Tuesday morning when I was just washing breakfast dishes. The soap bubbles on my fingers felt warm, ordinary, like any other moment in the quiet life I'd built after surviving cancer and burying my husband. But sometimes, the worst storms arrive on the clearest days. My name is Nadia, and I'm 55 years old. For most of my life, I've been the one others leaned on, the wife who held everything together, the mother who sacrificed without question, the daughter-in-law who bit her tongue when cruel words were thrown my way. I thought I'd earned some peace in my modest home, surrounded by the garden I'd planted with my own hands and the memories I'd carefully preserved. I was wrong. The message came from Mrs. Patterson, my elderly neighbor across the street. Her arthritis made typing difficult, so when my phone buzzed with her text, I knew something was seriously wrong. "Pretend you're sick and get out now." My heart stopped. Mrs. Patterson had been watching my house like a hawk ever since my husband passed, and she'd never sent me anything like this. Her words felt like ice water in my veins. I stood there in my kitchen, dish soap dripping from my hands onto the linoleum floor, staring at those 7 words that made no sense. Get out? From my own home? The house where I'd nursed my husband through his final months, where I'd fought my own battle with cancer and won, where every corner held memories of the life we'd built together brick by brick. 21 minutes. That's how long I had to process the impossible before my world shattered completely. 21 minutes of pacing from the kitchen to the living room, checking the locks, peering through curtains, wondering if Mrs. Patterson had finally lost her mind, or if something truly terrible was coming for me. Then I heard the key in the front door. My heart lifted for just a moment. Maybe it was Lucas, my son, coming for one of his rare visits. Maybe he'd brought good news for once, instead of the usual requests for money or complaints about his job. Maybe we could have coffee and talk like we used to when he was small and thought I hung the moon. But when the door opened, my son didn't call out "Mom" with warmth or concern. He walked in like he owned the place, which, I was about to discover, he apparently thought he did. Behind him came 2 strangers in expensive suits, carrying briefcases, and wearing the kind of serious expressions that people wear when they're about to destroy someone's life with paperwork. "Hello, Mother," Lucas said, and something in his tone made my blood turn cold. He hadn't called me Mother since he was 17 and angry about his curfew. For 38 years, I'd been Mom or Ma, or during the good times, Mama. But standing in my own living room, surrounded by the furniture I'd chosen and the photographs I'd framed, I was suddenly Mother, distant, formal, dismissible. The 2 men introduced themselves as representatives from Adult Protective Services and the County Mental Health Department. Their words blurred together in a legal soup that tasted like betrayal, concerning reports, cognitive decline, unsafe living conditions, emergency protective custody. But through the fog of their official language, one truth emerged with devastating clarity. My own son had declared me mentally unfit to care for myself. If you enjoy stories that touch the heart and reveal the strength hidden in ordinary people, please subscribe to our channel. We're working toward 1,000 subscribers, and your support means everything to us. Also, let us know in the comments what city you're watching from. It helps us connect with viewers like you. I watched Lucas avoid my eyes as the men explained their purpose. He stood by the window, looking out at Mrs. Patterson's house with an expression I couldn't read. Was it guilt? Determination? Or just the cold calculation of someone who'd decided his mother was an obstacle to be removed? "Mrs. Reyes," one of the suits said, his voice professionally gentle, "we've received reports that you've been exhibiting signs of confusion, memory loss, and poor judgment. Your son is concerned about your ability to manage your finances and maintain this property safely." The words hit me like physical blows. Confusion? Memory loss? Poor judgment? I was the woman who'd managed our household finances for 30 years while my husband built his business. I was the woman who'd researched every treatment option when cancer tried to claim me, who'd advocated for myself when doctors wanted to give up. I was the woman who'd single-handedly organized my husband's funeral, settled his estate, and rebuilt my life from the ground up. "There must be some mistake," I said, my voice smaller than I intended. "I'm perfectly capable of caring for myself. Lucas, tell them." But Lucas finally turned from the window, and the look in his eyes told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a plan, carefully executed, designed to strip me of my independence and my home in one devastating blow. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said, but his voice held no sorrow. "But you're not thinking clearly anymore. The house is too much for you. You need professional care. Professional care." The euphemism hung in the air like smoke, choking me with its implications. I thought of my garden, just beginning to bloom with spring flowers. I thought of my husband's workshop in the garage, still organized exactly as he'd left it. I thought of the photo albums tucked away in my bedroom closet, filled with memories that only I could properly tend. "I'm not going anywhere," I said, finding my voice again. "This is my home." But even as I spoke the words, I could see it was already too late. The paperwork was already filed. The decisions had already been made. And my own son, the baby I'd carried, the child I'd raised, the young man I'd supported through every failure and celebrated through every success, had been the one to set this machine in motion. The silence that followed was the kind that cuts deeper than screams. The men in suits gave me 48 hours to prepare for the transition, as they called it. 48 hours to pack up a lifetime and say goodbye to the only place that still felt like home. Lucas stayed behind after they left, but not to comfort me or explain himself. He walked through my house like a prospective buyer, making notes on his phone about furniture and asking casual questions about my husband's tools in the garage. "You won't need most of this stuff where you're going, Mom," he said, running his finger along my grandmother's china cabinet. "The facility provides everything. I can probably get a good price for some of these antiques." The facility. He said it like he was discussing a vacation resort, instead of the place where he planned to warehouse his mother like an inconvenient piece of furniture. I watched him evaluate my possessions with the cold efficiency of someone who'd already mentally divided up the spoils, and I realized this wasn't a recent decision. Lucas had been planning this for months, maybe longer. "When did you stop loving me?" I asked him as he examined my wedding photo, the one where his father and I looked so young and hopeful. "Was it gradual, or did you wake up one morning and decide I was disposable?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he set the photo face down on the mantel, like he couldn't bear to look at the happiness it represented. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weariness that made him sound older than his 38 years. "This isn't about love, Mom. It's about reality. You're getting older, you're alone, and this house is falling apart around you. What happens when you fall down the stairs? What happens when you forget to turn off the stove? What happens when you need money for your next failed business venture?" I interrupted, the words sharper than I'd intended. "Is that what this is really about, Lucas? The house?" His jaw tightened, and for a moment, I saw a flash of the boy who used to throw tantrums when he didn't get his way. "Everything isn't about money, isn't it?" I pressed. "Because that's the only time you visit anymore. When you need something. When your rent is late or your car breaks down or your girlfriend decides she wants something expensive. You haven't called just to talk to me in over 2 years. The truth hung between us like a bridge on fire. I thought back to the last time Lucas had seemed genuinely happy to see me. Christmas 3 years ago, before his latest girlfriend convinced him that family gatherings were toxic and emotionally draining. He'd brought her to dinner, a woman named Crystal with sharp edges and sharper opinions about how Lucas needed to set boundaries with his codependent mother. I'd bitten my tongue through that entire meal, watching this stranger dissect my relationship with my son like she was performing surgery. She spoke about me in the third person while I sat right there, explaining to Lucas how mothers like me used guilt and obligation to control their children. By dessert, I could see the seeds of doubt she'd planted taking root in his mind. "Crystal thinks," he started to say, then caught himself. "Ah," I said, pieces clicking into place. "This is her idea, isn't it? Get rid of the inconvenient mother so you two can start fresh. Maybe use the house as collateral for whatever scheme she's cooking up this time." Lucas's face flushed red. "Don't talk about her like that. Crystal's been more supportive of me than your own mother," I finished. "The woman who raised you alone after your father died? The woman who worked 2 jobs to put you through college? The woman who co-signed for your first apartment and bailed you out when you couldn't make rent? You always do this," he said, his voice rising. "You always make everything about what you've sacrificed, what you've given up. Do you know how exhausting that is? Do you know what it's like to carry around that guilt every single day?" His words hit me like slaps. I stared at this man I'd carried in my body, nursed through fevers, cheered at baseball games, and supported through every disappointment and failure. When had my love become a burden to him? When had my sacrifices transformed from gifts into weapons he felt I wielded against him? "I never asked you to feel guilty," I whispered. "I just asked you to remember." "Remember what? How you martyred yourself for me? How you never dated anyone after Dad died because you were too busy being a mother? How you turned down that job promotion because you didn't want to miss my high school graduation?" He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You built your entire identity around being my mother, and now you can't understand why I need space to breathe." The accusation stole my breath. Was that really how he saw me? As some suffocating presence who'd trapped him in obligation and guilt? I thought about all those years when it was just the two of us, how I'd tried so hard to be both mother and father, to give him everything he needed despite having so little. I'd thought I was being strong. He'd apparently seen me as being pathetic. "Your father would be ashamed of you," I said, the words escaping before I could stop them. Something dark flickered across Lucas's face. Don't you dare use Dad against me. He's not here to defend you or condemn me. He's gone, and you need to stop living like he's coming back." "I know he's gone," I said, my voice breaking. "I'm the one who held his hand when he died. I'm the one who planned his funeral. I'm the one who's been visiting his grave every month for the past 5 years while you visited exactly twice. Because I can't compete with a ghost," Lucas exploded. "Do you think I don't know that you love him more than you ever loved me? Do you think I don't see how you light up when you talk about him, and how disappointed you look when you have to deal with me instead?" The accusation was so unfair, so twisted, that it took my breath away. "That's not true. That's not, isn't it?" He pulled out his phone and showed me something that made my stomach drop. It was a photo I'd posted on social media last month. A picture of my husband's grave decorated with flowers for what would have been his 60th birthday. The caption read, "Still missing the love of my life. Some people leave footprints on your heart that never fade." "Crystal showed me this," Lucas said. "She asked me how it felt to know that my mother considers my dead father the love of her life." What does that make me, Mom? What does that make my children if I ever have any? Will we always be second place to your perfect memories of a man who's been dead for 5 years? I wanted to explain that love isn't a competition, that a widow's love for her husband doesn't diminish her love for her child. I wanted to tell him that grief and motherhood occupied different spaces in my heart, that honoring his father's memory didn't mean I valued him less. But the words wouldn't come, and Lucas took my silence as confirmation of his worst fears. "The papers are filed," he said, putting his phone away. "The evaluation is scheduled for Thursday. Crystal helped me research the best facilities in the area. Sunny Meadows has excellent reviews and they specialize in cases like yours, cases like mine. As if being a loving mother and devoted widow was a medical condition requiring treatment. And if I refuse to go, then the state will intervene. The psychologist's preliminary assessment supports my petition. You'll be declared incompetent whether you cooperate or not, but if you fight it, the process will be public, messy. Do you really want the neighbors seeing you dragged out by social workers?" The threat was delivered with surgical precision. Lucas knew exactly how to hurt me, knew that my pride and dignity were among the few things I had left. He was offering me the choice between surrendering quietly or being humiliated in front of the community I'd called home for 30 years. As he gathered his things to leave, I tried one last time to reach the son I remembered. "Lucas, please, this is still your home too. Your childhood bedroom is exactly the way you left it. Your father's tools are waiting for you in the garage. Don't throw all of that away." He paused at the front door, his hand on the knob. For a moment, I thought I saw something soften in his expression, some flicker of the boy who used to run to me when he was scared or hurt. "Goodbye, Mom," he said without turning around. "The movers will be here Friday to collect Dad's things. Crystal thinks they'll do well at auction." The door closed behind him with a soft click that sounded like the end of everything. That night, I called every number in my phone book, searching for someone who might help me understand what was happening. My sister Elena in Phoenix listened for 20 minutes before gently suggesting that maybe Lucas had a point about me needing more support. My college roommate Margaret promised to call back but never did. Even my doctor's office, when I called in desperation, told me they couldn't discuss my case without proper authorization that apparently now belonged to my son. By Wednesday morning, I realized how completely alone I'd become. The life I'd built so carefully had been stripped down to its bare bones. And those bones were more fragile than I'd ever imagined. Still, I wasn't ready to surrender. I dressed in my best navy suit, the one I'd worn to job interviews and parent-teacher conferences, and drove to the courthouse to see if I could stop this legal avalanche before it buried me completely. The clerk at the probate office looked at me with the practiced sympathy of someone who'd seen this drama play out 1,000 times before. She explained that Lucas had filed a petition for guardianship based on medical recommendations I'd never heard of, from doctors I'd never seen. According to the paperwork, I'd been exhibiting signs of dementia for months, forgetting appointments I'd never made, neglecting bills I'd always paid on time, showing poor judgment in financial matters I'd managed flawlessly for decades. But none of this is true, I told her, my voice echoing off the sterile courthouse walls. I keep meticulous records. I can show you my checkbook, my calendar, my medical files. I'm perfectly capable of managing my own affairs. The clerk's expression softened, but her words remained firm. I understand your frustration, Mrs. Reyes, but the petition has been filed properly, and the preliminary evaluation supports the concerns raised by your son. You'll have an opportunity to contest the findings at the hearing, but you'll need legal representation. Legal representation. The phrase might as well have been spoken in a foreign language. I'd never needed a lawyer before. Never imagined a day when I'd have to prove my sanity to strangers in a courtroom. The attorneys I called wanted retainers I couldn't afford. $5,000, $8,000, $10,000 just to begin fighting for my own freedom. I'm sorry, one lawyer's secretary told me after I explained my situation, but guardianship cases are complex and time-consuming. Without a significant retainer, we can't take on new clients. So I decided to represent myself. I spent hours at the public library, printing articles about elder abuse and legal rights, building a case that I prayed would be strong enough to save me. I organized bank statements, medical records, anything that might prove I was the victim of a conspiracy rather than a woman losing her mind. But as Thursday approached, I began to understand how the system worked against people like me. The preliminary psychological evaluation had been conducted by Dr. Sarah Chen, a specialist Lucas had somehow found and paid for. I'd never met this woman, never spoke to her, yet she'd somehow concluded that I was exhibiting significant cognitive decline and poor reality testing. When I called Dr. Chen's office to demand an explanation, her receptionist informed me that the evaluation had been based on collateral information provided by concerned family members. In other words, Lucas and Crystal had painted a picture of a confused, incompetent woman, and Dr. Chen had accepted their version of reality without ever speaking to me directly. But that's not legal, is it? I asked the receptionist, desperation creeping into my voice. Don't you have to actually examine someone before declaring them mentally unfit? I'm sorry, Mrs. Reyes, but I can't discuss patient cases over the phone, came the practiced response. If you'd like to schedule an appointment to discuss the findings, Dr. Chen has an opening next month. Next month, after the hearing, after the decision, after my fate had already been sealed. Thursday morning arrived gray and humid, the kind of weather that makes everything feel heavier than it should. I put on my navy suit again and drove to the courthouse with a briefcase full of evidence that I hoped would prove my competency. Mrs. Patterson had offered to come as a character witness, but at 83, her own testimony might be dismissed as easily as mine. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, with fluorescent lights that cast everything in an unflattering yellow glow. Lucas sat at a table with a sharp-dressed attorney who looked like he'd stepped out of a legal drama, while Crystal sat behind them in the gallery, checking her phone with the bored expression of someone attending a routine appointment. I sat alone at the respondent's table, my homemade files spread before me like talismans against disaster. The court-appointed guardian ad litem, a tired-looking woman named Ms. Rivera, introduced herself and explained that she was there to represent my best interests, though her demeanor suggested she'd already decided what those interests were. When the judge asked Lucas to explain his concerns, my son transformed into someone I barely recognized. Gone was the angry defensive man who'd argued with me in my living room. In his place sat a concerned, articulate son who spoke about his mother's declining condition with just the right mixture of sorrow and determination. He told stories I'd never heard before, about times I'd supposedly called him confused and disoriented, about bills I'd allegedly forgotten to pay, about neighbors who'd expressed concern about my behavior. He painted a picture of a woman spiraling into dementia while stubbornly refusing help, a woman who posed a danger to herself and potentially to others. "I love my mother deeply," he said, his voice breaking at exactly the right moment. "But I can't stand by and watch her hurt herself out of pride. She deserves care and dignity in her final years, not the isolation and confusion she's experiencing now." Final years. The phrase hit me like a physical blow. In Lucas's version of events, I wasn't a healthy 55-year-old woman with decades of life ahead of me. I was a tragic figure in decline, someone whose best days were already behind her. When it was my turn to speak, I stood on shaking legs and tried to present my evidence. I showed bank statements proving my financial competency, medical records confirming my good health, testimonials from neighbors who'd witnessed my daily routines. But with each document I presented, I could see the judge's expression growing more concerned, not about Lucas's claims, but about my apparent inability to accept reality. "Mrs. Reyes," the judge said gently, interrupting my presentation, "it's not uncommon for individuals experiencing cognitive decline to maintain certain functional abilities while losing capacity in other areas. The fact that you can balance your checkbook doesn't necessarily mean you have the judgment required to make complex decisions about your care and safety." The words were delivered with kindness, but they landed like bullets. In the judge's mind, my very competence was evidence of my incompetence. My ability to organize and present my case was being interpreted as proof that I was delusional about my own condition. Dr. Chen testified via telephone, describing her evaluation process in clinical terms that made me sound like a textbook case of early-onset dementia. She spoke about sundowning behaviors and anosognosia, the inability to recognize one's own cognitive decline. According to her professional opinion, my insistence on my own competency was actually a symptom of the very disease I claimed not to have. "The subject presents with classic signs of early-stage dementia," Dr. Chen explained to the court. "Her family reports increasing confusion, poor judgment in financial matters, and aggressive resistance to appropriate interventions." The subject's own presentation today, her insistence on representing herself and her elaborate documentation, actually supports the diagnosis of poor reality testing and compromised decision-making capacity. I wanted to scream that I was sitting right there, that I could hear every word, that I was a person with thoughts and feelings and rights, not just a subject to be discussed and disposed of. But I could see that anything I said would only be used as further evidence of my supposed condition. The hearing lasted 3 hours, though it felt like 3 days. When it was over, the judge announced his decision with the weary efficiency of someone who'd made this ruling many times before. Lucas would be granted emergency guardianship, with full authority over my medical decisions, finances, and living arrangements. I would be transported to Sunny Meadows Care Facility that afternoon for my own safety and well-being. "I want to assure Mrs. Reyes that this decision is made with her best interests at heart," the judge said, looking directly at me for the first time since the hearing began. "Guardianship isn't a punishment. It's a protection for individuals who can no longer safely manage their own affairs." As the gavel fell, I felt something inside me break that had nothing to do with bones or hearts. It was deeper than that. The fundamental trust that had allowed me to believe the world was a place where truth mattered, where love protected, where good intentions were rewarded with justice. Lucas approached my table as the courtroom began to empty, his lawyer already packing up his victory. "Mom, I know you're angry, but this really is for the best. Sunny Meadows is a beautiful facility, and you'll make friends there. You might even be happier." I looked up at this stranger who wore my son's face, and for a moment, I couldn't remember why I'd fought so hard to keep him in my life. "Don't ever call me Mom again," I said quietly. "Mothers are for children who love them back." The transport van arrived exactly on schedule, driven by 2 kind attendants who treated me with the gentle courtesy reserved for the broken and defeated. As we pulled away from the courthouse, I caught a glimpse of Crystal waiting by Lucas's car, smoking a cigarette and checking her watch like she had somewhere more important to be. Through the van's window, I watched my old life disappear block by block, until even the courthouse clock tower faded into the distance behind us. Sunny Meadows wasn't sunny, and there were no meadows. The facility sat like a beige fortress behind manicured lawns that residents weren't allowed to walk on without supervision. My room was a sterile box with institutional furniture bolted to the floor and windows that opened exactly 4 inches. Enough for air, but not enough for freedom. They'd given me a roommate named Dorothy, who spent most days staring at a soap opera she couldn't hear through headphones that hadn't worked in months. The first week, I tried to explain to anyone who would listen that I didn't belong there. I showed the nurses my mental sharpness, recited poetry I'd memorized in college, discussed current events with the clarity of someone who'd been following the news religiously for 55 years. But every display of competence was noted in my chart as grandiose thinking or lack of insight into condition. Dr. Martinez, the facility's psychiatrist, met with me twice a week to assess my adjustment. She was a pleasant woman in her 40s who spoke to me with the kind of gentle condescension usually reserved for children and golden retrievers. During our sessions, she'd ask me about my feelings and my family, then type notes into her tablet while nodding sympathetically. "Nadia, I understand you're having difficulty accepting your situation," she said during our 3rd meeting. "But resistance only makes the transition harder. Many of our residents find peace once they stop fighting the process and start focusing on the activities and friendships available here. Activities, bingo games where the prizes were travel-sized bottles of lotion, art therapy sessions where we painted flowers with watercolors that bled together into muddy browns, music hour, where a volunteer with a guitar led us through songs from the 1940s, apparently assuming that anyone over 50 must have been born during World War II. The other residents fell into 2 categories: those who genuinely needed intensive care due to advanced dementia, and those like me who'd been warehoused by families who found them inconvenient. Mrs. Patterson would have fit perfectly into the second group, which made me wonder how many other competent women had been discarded here because they'd become burdens to children who valued convenience over compassion. I tried calling Lucas several times during those first weeks, but the nurses informed me that he'd requested limited contact while I adjusted to my new environment. When I finally did reach him, 3 weeks after my arrival, his voice carried the forced cheerfulness of someone trying to convince himself he'd done the right thing. "How are you settling in, Mom?" he asked, though his tone suggested he didn't really want an honest answer. "I'm not your mother anymore," I reminded him. "Remember? And I'm not settling in. I'm being held prisoner by my own son. Don't be dramatic. Sunny Meadows is a beautiful facility. Crystal and I visited last week and—" "You visited?" I interrupted. "You were here and didn't see me?" "We met with the staff to discuss your care plan. Dr. Martinez says you're having some adjustment difficulties, but that's normal. She's optimizing your medications to help with the anxiety and confusion." Medications. That was another indignity I hadn't anticipated. Dr. Martinez had prescribed a cocktail of drugs supposedly designed to help with my behavioral issues, anti-anxiety medication that made me feel like I was viewing the world through thick fog, sleep aids that left me groggy until noon, and mood stabilizers that flattened every emotion until I felt like a walking shadow of myself. "I don't need medications," I told Lucas. "I need my freedom. I need my home." "Mom, please don't make this harder than it has to be. The house has already been sold. Crystal found a buyer who was willing to pay cash and close quickly." The words hit me like ice water. "Sold? You sold my house? Without telling me? I have financial power of attorney. The facility is expensive, and you need the money for your care. We got a good price. Enough to cover your expenses here for several years." Several years. The casual way he said it made my legs go weak. In Lucas's mind, this wasn't a temporary arrangement until I could prove my competency. This was my life now, my future, my final chapter. "What about your father's workshop? His tools? All our photographs?" Crystal organized an estate sale. Most of Dad's tools went to collectors who really appreciated them. "The photos are in storage. Don't worry, we kept the important ones." Crystal had decided which memories were important. Crystal had cataloged and dispersed the artifacts of my 30-year marriage. Crystal had sold my husband's tools to strangers while I sat in a sterile room being force-fed medication that turned my thoughts to cotton. "I hate you," I whispered into the phone, the words escaping before I could stop them. "I love you too, Mom," Lucas replied, and I could hear the relief in his voice. He'd interpreted my hatred as evidence of the mental illness he needed me to have, proof that his actions had been necessary and justified. After he hung up, I sat in the facility's common room and watched other residents shuffle through their daily routines. Mrs. Chen played solitaire with cards so worn the numbers were barely visible. Mr. Rodriguez stared out the window at the parking lot, waiting for visitors who came less and less frequently. Mrs. Williams asked the nursing staff every hour when her son was coming to take her home, never remembering that he'd stopped visiting months ago. I realized I was looking at my future, an endless succession of identical days, punctuated by meals I didn't choose, activities I didn't enjoy, and medications that made me care less and less about the prison I'd been locked inside. Slowly, gradually, the part of me that fought would be worn away until I became like these other residents, grateful for small kindnesses, accepting of my diminished circumstances, too medicated to rage against the injustice of it all. The worst part wasn't the loss of freedom or privacy or dignity. The worst part was feeling my own mind adapting to captivity. Some mornings, I woke up and for just a moment, I couldn't remember why I was angry. The medications dulled not just my emotions but my memory, making the sharp edges of injustice feel soft and distant. I caught myself joining in bingo games, not because I enjoyed them, but because they filled the empty hours. I stopped refusing the evening medications, not because I wanted them, but because fighting every day exhausted me more than the drugs did. One evening, while watching a movie I'd seen a dozen times before, I realized I couldn't remember what my bedroom at home had looked like. The details were fuzzy. Was the comforter blue or green? Did the dresser sit by the window or against the wall? The harder I tried to remember, the more the memories seemed to slip away, replaced by the institutional beige of my current surroundings. That night, I lay in bed, listening to Dorothy's labored breathing, and wondered if this was how it would end, not with a dramatic fight for justice, but with a slow fade into acceptance. Maybe Lucas was right. Maybe I was becoming the confused, helpless woman he'd described to the court. Maybe the medications and the routine and the endless empty days were transforming me into exactly what they said I already was. I closed my eyes and tried to remember my husband's face, but all I could see was the framed photograph that Crystal had deemed important enough to keep. Even my memories were being curated by someone else now, filtered through their judgment of what mattered and what could be discarded. The next morning brought news that shattered what little hope I had left. Mrs. Patterson had suffered a stroke and been admitted to the hospital. The one person who might have testified to my competency, who'd witnessed my daily life, and could vouch for my mental clarity, was now fighting for her own life in intensive care. "I'm sorry to hear about your friend," Dr. Martinez said when she delivered the news. "I know you two were close. Sometimes these sudden losses can trigger depression in our residents. I'm going to increase your antidepressant dose to help you through this difficult time. More medication, more fog, more distance from the woman I used to be." That afternoon, I sat in the garden courtyard, the only outdoor space residents were allowed to access without supervision, and tried to feel something other than the chemical numbness that had become my default state. The sun was warm on my face, and somewhere beyond the facility's walls, I could hear the sound of children playing in a nearby schoolyard. Their laughter carried on the wind like an echo from a world I was no longer part of. I thought about Mrs. Patterson lying unconscious in a hospital bed, probably surrounded by relatives who'd gather to say goodbye and settle her affairs. I thought about my own house, now belonging to strangers who would never know about the rose bush my husband planted for our anniversary, or the loose board on the front porch that creaked in exactly the right way to announce visitors. For the first time since arriving at Sunny Meadows, I stopped fighting the despair that had been pressing at the edges of my consciousness. I let it wash over me like a dark tide, pulling me under until I couldn't remember why struggling had ever seemed important. But somewhere in that darkness something stirred. Not hope exactly, but something quieter and more dangerous. Something that whispered that even if I couldn't save myself, maybe I could still ensure that Lucas and Crystal didn't get away with what they'd done completely unscathed. Something that reminded me I wasn't just a victim. I was also my husband's wife, and he'd left me more than just memories and tools. He'd left me secrets that even Crystal's careful cataloging hadn't uncovered. I wasn't ready to disappear just yet. 2 months into my imprisonment at Sunny Meadows, I stopped talking during Dr. Martinez's sessions. Not because the medications had stolen my words, but because I'd realized that every protest, every rational argument, every display of mental clarity was being used as evidence against me. So I became what they expected, a quiet, compliant woman who nodded at appropriate moments and answered questions with the kind of vacant pleasantness that satisfied their need to see me as mentally diminished. Much better, Dr. Martinez noted in her chart after our first silent session. Patient appears to be accepting her situation and showing less oppositional behavior. Medication adjustment appears effective, but my silence wasn't surrender. It was strategy. While they congratulated themselves on successfully medicating me into submission, I was watching, listening, learning the rhythms of a place that operated on the assumption that its residents had lost the capacity for clear thought. The night shift nurses often gossiped freely around patients they believed couldn't understand or remember. The administrators discussed financial matters as if we were furniture. And slowly, I began to piece together how places like Sunny Meadows really worked. The facility made its money by keeping beds filled long-term. Families paid approximately $8,000 monthly for comprehensive care, and the longer residents stayed, the more profitable they became. Quick recoveries and successful transitions back to independent living were discouraged, not through malice, but through simple economics. A resident who regained competency and left was a revenue stream lost forever. Dr. Martinez genuinely believed she was helping people, but her definition of help involved making patients comfortable with their circumstances rather than working toward any kind of real recovery. The medications weren't designed to cure or improve cognitive function. They were designed to manage behavior and reduce the kind of agitation that made families feel guilty about their decisions. I learned this during my third month, when I overheard a conversation between Dr. Martinez and the facility director about Mrs. Williams, whose son had been pressuring them to reduce her medications so she could be more alert during his visits. "We need to be careful about that family," the director said as they passed by the common room where I sat pretending to watch television. "If she becomes too lucid, she might start asking questions about going home. Better to keep her stable at current levels and suggest to the son that these brief periods of clarity are actually signs of the disease progressing." They walked away discussing medication strategies like military tactics, and I understood with crystal clarity that recovering from this place wasn't just about proving my sanity. It was about navigating a system designed to prevent exactly that kind of proof from being accepted as valid. That realization changed something fundamental in my approach. Instead of fighting against my captivity, I decided to use it. I had access to a computer during supervised internet time, ostensibly for playing simple games and reading approved websites. But I also had 8 uninterrupted hours every night when the nursing staff assumed I was sleeping peacefully under the influence of my evening medications. I'd learned to palm the pills during distribution, checking them under my tongue until I could safely dispose of them later. It took weeks to clear enough of the drugs from my system to think with real clarity again, but gradually, my mind sharpened like a blade being honed on stone. The fog lifted, and for the first time since arriving at Sunny Meadows, I could think several moves ahead. During those midnight hours when the facility was quiet except for the sounds of elderly people struggling through medicated sleep, I began to remember things I'd forced myself to forget. Details about my marriage that I'd buried after my husband's death because they'd seemed too painful to examine. Conversations about his business that I'd dismissed as boring at the time but now took on new significance. My husband Roberto had been a careful man, meticulous about record-keeping and suspicious of leaving important matters to chance. He'd run a small construction company for 25 years, building a reputation for honest work and fair dealing. But in the months before his death, he'd become increasingly worried about something he wouldn't discuss with me directly. "If anything happens to me," he'd said one evening while organizing papers in his home office, "don't let Lucas handle the business accounts until you've gone through everything yourself. There are things he doesn't understand about how I've structured certain arrangements." At the time, I'd assumed he was being typically overprotective, making sure I understood our finances in case I needed to manage them alone. After his death, I'd been too consumed with grief and Lucas's immediate needs to pay much attention to the specifics of the business closure. Lucas had handled most of the details, assuring me that everything had been settled appropriately and the accounts properly closed. But lying in my institutional bed at 3 a.m, I began to wonder what Roberto had been trying to tell me. What arrangements had he made that Lucas didn't understand? What had he wanted me to find before anyone else got their hands on his records? The more I thought about it, the more I remembered other odd details from those final months. Roberto had insisted on installing a new safe in his workshop, claiming he needed better security for important documents. He'd spent hours organizing files that had never seemed particularly significant before, and he'd made several trips to meet with his attorney without inviting me along, which was unusual for a man who'd included me in every major decision for 30 years. "I'm setting up some protections," he'd explained when I asked about the lawyer visits. "Nothing you need to worry about now, but arrangements that will matter later if circumstances change. Circumstances like a son who turned out to be willing to betray his own mother for money. Circumstances like a daughter-in-law who viewed family assets as her personal treasure hunt. Circumstances like a woman being declared incompetent by people who'd never bothered to understand what she was actually capable of achieving." During my 4th month at Sunny Meadows, I received an unexpected visitor. Mrs. Patterson's niece Carol had come to tell me that her aunt had passed away peacefully in her sleep 3 weeks after her stroke, but she'd also brought something else. A manila envelope that Mrs. Patterson had specifically requested be delivered to me. "Aunt Ruth was very insistent about this," Carol explained as we sat in the facility's sterile visiting room. "Even when she could barely speak, she kept asking about you and mentioning this envelope. She said you'd understand what it meant." Inside the envelope were copies of documents Mrs. Patterson had apparently been collecting for months: bank statements, property records, business filings, all related to the sale of my house and the dissolution of Roberto's construction company. At first glance, they looked like the routine paperwork associated with settling an estate, but Mrs. Patterson had highlighted certain details in yellow marker, drawing attention to discrepancies that I'd never noticed. The sale price of my house, for instance, was listed differently on various documents. On the real estate transfer, Lucas had reported receiving $400,000, but on the guardianship financial filing, he'd claimed the house sold for only $250,000. The difference, $150,000, had simply vanished from the official record. Similarly, Roberto's business accounts showed final balances that didn't match the amounts Lucas had reported to the probate court. Tools and equipment that should have been worth tens of thousands of dollars had been sold for fractions of their value to buyers whose names I didn't recognize. And there were payments to Crystal's consulting business, a company I'd never heard of until that moment, for estate management services that totaled more than $30,000. Mrs. Patterson had been watching. Even in her 80s, confined to her house and dealing with her own health problems, she'd been paying attention to the systematic theft of my life. She'd documented evidence that Lucas and Crystal had been embezzling from my assets while portraying themselves as concerned family members acting in my best interests. But the most important item in the envelope wasn't highlighted or marked. It was a simple business card for Roberto's attorney, James Morrison, with a handwritten note on the back. "Ask him about the trust arrangements. Ruth Patterson. Trust arrangements." The phrase sent electricity through my nervous system as pieces of a puzzle I'd never known existed began clicking into place. Roberto had been planning for contingencies I'd never imagined, setting up protections against threats he'd somehow anticipated. And somewhere in the legal labyrinth he'd constructed, there might be weapons I could use to fight back against the people who'd stolen my life. That night, I lay in my narrow bed and felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Not hope exactly, but purpose. Roberto had left me more than memories and regrets. He'd left me tools, carefully hidden and precisely calibrated for exactly the kind of battle I was now facing. For the first time since arriving at Sunny Meadows, I smiled without having to force the expression for someone else's benefit. Lucas and Crystal thought they'd conquered a helpless old woman. They were about to discover they'd actually awakened a widow with nothing left to lose and a dead husband who'd taught her how to plan for war. I closed my eyes and began making lists, not of grievances or regrets, but of strategies and priorities. Tomorrow, I would begin the careful work of rebuilding my life from the inside out. But tonight, I allowed myself the luxury of imagining Lucas's face when he realized what his father had actually left behind. It wasn't going to be enough to escape from Sunny Meadows. I was going to make sure that everyone who'd participated in putting me here paid the full price for their cruelty. The game was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. Getting access to a phone that wasn't monitored by the facility staff required patience and careful observation. I spent weeks studying the patterns of the night shift, learning which nurses made rounds when, which doors were left unlocked during shift changes, and where the administrative offices kept their landlines. At 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in my 5th month at Sunny Meadows, I finally had my opportunity. The call to James Morrison's emergency line was answered on the 3rd ring by a man who sounded surprisingly alert for someone being contacted in the middle of the night. "Mr. Morrison, this is Nadia Reyes, Roberto's widow. I'm calling about trust arrangements my neighbor mentioned before she died." The silence that followed stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had been disconnected. When Morrison finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that suggested he'd been expecting this conversation for months. "Mrs. Reyes, I've been wondering when you'd contact me. Where are you calling from? The number shows up as Sunny Meadows Care Facility, because that's where my son had me committed after declaring me mentally incompetent. Roberto's business assets have been liquidated, our house has been sold, and I'm being held here against my will while they drain what's left of our estate." Another pause. "Are you somewhere private where you can talk freely?" "For about 10 minutes, yes. After that, the night nurse will make her rounds and I need to be back in my room." Listen carefully, Nadia. Roberto anticipated this exact scenario. He came to me 8 months before his death with concerns about Lucas's financial judgment and what he called troubling influences in his son's life. We established a revocable trust with very specific conditions and protections. My heart hammered against my ribs as Morrison continued explaining the legal architecture Roberto had constructed around our assets. The trust had been designed to look simple on the surface, a straightforward estate plan that would transfer everything to me upon Roberto's death, then to Lucas upon mine. But buried in the technical language were triggers and safeguards that most people would never notice. The trust specifically protects against involuntary commitment based on questionable competency determinations, Morrison explained. If you were ever declared mentally incompetent without a thorough evaluation by multiple independent physicians, the trust automatically reverts to a backup structure that Lucas cannot access or control. But Lucas has already sold everything: the house, the business assets, even Roberto's personal tools. He's sold what he thinks he owns. But legally, none of those transactions are valid if they were conducted while you were being unlawfully held. And Nadia, based on what you've told me, your commitment was absolutely unlawful. The psychiatric evaluation was conducted without your consent or knowledge by a doctor who never examined you. That violates every standard of medical ethics and legal procedure. Morrison's words hit me like electrical current, charging every nerve in my body with the energy I'd thought was gone forever. Roberto had seen this coming somehow, had anticipated his son's weakness and the predatory people who would exploit it. While I'd been grieving and trying to rebuild my life, my husband had been constructing a legal fortress designed to protect me from the exact betrayal I was now experiencing. "What do I need to do?" I asked, acutely aware that my 10-minute window was shrinking. "First, you need to get out of that facility. As long as you're there, Lucas maintains his guardianship authority and can continue making decisions about your care and finances. Second, you need to undergo a proper psychiatric evaluation by independent professionals who aren't connected to Lucas or the facility. Third, we need to document every financial transaction that's been made since your commitment. And if I can't get out, if they won't release me, then we go to court. I've been preparing a case for months, waiting for you to contact me. Roberto gave me permission to act on your behalf if specific circumstances arose, and those circumstances have definitely been met." The sound of footsteps in the corridor outside the administrative office sent panic shooting through my system. "I have to go. The nurse is coming." "Nadia, listen. Tomorrow at exactly 11 a.m., call this number again. I'll have a plan ready, and I'll know more about our legal options. Don't give up now. Roberto knew you were stronger than anyone realized, including yourself. He was counting on that strength to see you through this." I disconnected the call and slipped back to my room with 30 seconds to spare, sliding into bed just as Nurse Patterson, no relation to my deceased neighbor, appeared in the doorway for her routine check. My heart was still racing, but for the first time in months, it was racing with excitement rather than fear. Over the next 3 days, I continued my facade of medicated compliance while internally organizing the information Morrison had shared. Roberto's trust was more sophisticated than I'd ever imagined, designed not just to protect our assets, but to detect and punish the kind of exploitation Lucas had attempted. Every fraudulent sale, every forged document, every illegal transaction had been creating evidence that could be used against him in court. but the trust's protections would only activate if I could prove my competency and challenge the guardianship order. As long as I remained at Sunny Meadows under Dr. Martinez's care, Lucas could maintain his legal authority over my affairs indefinitely. I needed to find a way out that wouldn't immediately trigger alarms or give him time to cover his tracks further. The solution came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Chen, my elderly roommate who spent most days in apparent confusion, had been listening to my phone conversations with Morrison. During one of our supervised internet time sessions, she leaned over and whispered something that made my blood run cold. "I'm not as confused as they think either," she said quietly, her eyes remaining fixed on the solitaire game on her computer screen. "My daughter put me here because she wanted my condo in San Francisco. I've been documenting everything, waiting for the right opportunity to fight back." Mrs. Chen had been playing the same game I was, pretending to be diminished while actually gathering evidence and planning her escape. But unlike me, she'd been doing it for over 2 years, and she'd learned things about Sunny Meadows that could benefit both of us. "The facility has a protocol for medical emergencies," she explained during our next private conversation. "If a resident requires specialized care that can't be provided here, they have to transfer them to a regular hospital. Once you're in a hospital setting, the guardianship authority becomes more complicated, and you have access to patient advocacy services. How do I trigger a medical emergency without actually hurting myself?" Mrs. Chen smiled with the cunning of someone who'd been planning this conversation for months. "You don't trigger it. I do. I've been saving my heart medication for weeks, building up enough for what will look like an accidental overdose. When they find me tomorrow morning, I'll be unconscious, but stable. They'll have to call an ambulance." "Mrs. Chen, you could die from that. At my age, with my conditions, I might die here anyway. At least this way, I'll die fighting for my freedom instead of rotting away in this place." She paused, studying my expression. "But I'm not planning to die. I'm planning to be unconscious just long enough to get transferred to a real hospital, where real doctors can evaluate my condition and question why I'm being held here. What does that have to do with me? You're going to have a panic attack when you find me. A severe psychological crisis brought on by witnessing a medical emergency. Standard protocol requires that any resident experiencing acute psychological distress be evaluated at a hospital facility, not just medicated and monitored here." The plan was brilliant in its simplicity and terrifying in its risks. If Mrs. Chen miscalculated her medication doses, she could suffer permanent heart damage or death. If I couldn't convince the staff that discovering her unconscious had triggered genuine psychological trauma, they'd simply increase my medications and monitor me more closely. But if everything worked correctly, we'd both be in a hospital setting within 24 hours, with access to medical professionals who weren't part of Sunny Meadows' profit-driven system. "Why are you willing to help me?" I asked her. "Because I've been watching you for months, and you remind me of myself before they broke my spirit the first time. You still have fight left in you, and more importantly, you have someone on the outside who's planning to help you use it." She reached over and squeezed my hand with surprising strength. "Besides, I'd rather risk dying free than definitely die in captivity." That night, I called Morrison again and explained Mrs. Chen's plan. His response was immediate and decisive. "If you can get transferred to General Hospital, I can have independent psychiatric evaluators waiting. I've already contacted Dr. Elizabeth Warren. She's a forensic psychiatrist who specializes in cases involving questionable competency determinations. She's reviewed the records from your original evaluation, and she's prepared to testify that the process was fundamentally flawed. And if the plan fails, then we go with option 2. I file an emergency petition challenging your guardianship based on procedural violations. It'll take longer and be more public, but Roberto's trust provides the legal standing we need to demand a full investigation." I hung up the phone and returned to my room, where Mrs. Chen was lying in bed staring at the ceiling with the expression of someone who'd made peace with a dangerous decision. "Tomorrow changes everything," she said quietly. "For both of us," I agreed. "Nadia, when they ask you about finding me, don't hold back on the emotion. Let them see real terror, real panic. Make them believe that discovering me unconscious triggered something in you that requires immediate professional intervention." I nodded, though the irony wasn't lost on me. After months of suppressing my emotions to avoid giving the staff evidence of psychological instability, I was now planning to display exactly the kind of dramatic distress that would normally be used to justify increased confinement. As I lay in bed that night, listening to Mrs. Chen's steady breathing and wondering if it might be the last time I heard it, I thought about Roberto and the elaborate protective measures he'd constructed around my future. He'd anticipated threats I'd never imagined, planned for contingencies that seemed impossible until they became my reality. Tomorrow, I would find out whether his planning had been thorough enough to save me, or whether his widow was destined to disappear into the institutional maze that had already swallowed so many other inconvenient women. Either way, the waiting was almost over. At 6:47 a.m., I found Mrs. Chen collapsed beside her bed, her face pale gray, and her breathing shallow but steady. For a moment, genuine panic overwhelmed me. Had she miscalculated the dosage? Was I witnessing the death of the only person who'd shown me real kindness in this place? Then I saw the almost imperceptible wink she gave me before closing her eyes again, and I knew the performance had begun. My screams brought 3 nurses running. I let every suppressed emotion from the past 5 months pour out in a torrent of hysteria that required no acting whatsoever. The terror of being trapped, the rage at my son's betrayal, the desperation of watching my life disappear piece by piece. It all erupted in a display of psychological distress that had the staff exchanging concerned glances within minutes. "Please, please don't let her die," I sobbed, clinging to Nurse Patterson's arm with the desperation of someone whose last friend was slipping away. "She's the only person here who understands me. She's the only one who listens when I try to explain that I don't belong here." While the paramedics worked on Mrs. Chen, loading her onto a stretcher with professional efficiency, I continued my breakdown with calculated precision. I hyperventilated until my hands cramped, cried until my eyes swelled nearly shut, and repeated over and over that I couldn't bear to lose another person I loved. Dr. Martinez arrived just as the ambulance was pulling away, and I could see her clinical mind processing the scene before her. A patient she'd believed was stabilizing had suddenly decompensated into acute psychological crisis. The kind of crisis that required immediate intervention and careful evaluation to prevent self-harm or complete mental collapse. "Nadia, I need you to try to calm down," she said, kneeling beside the chair where I was still shaking and sobbing. "Mrs. Chen is getting the best possible care. This kind of medical emergency isn't uncommon for someone her age with her conditions. But what if she dies?" I wailed, letting genuine fear leak into my voice. What if I'm stuck here forever with no one who believes me? What if everyone I care about just disappears and leaves me alone with people who think I'm crazy? The questions weren't entirely performance. Beneath the calculated hysteria was real terror about my future, real grief for the life that had been stolen from me, real desperation to escape before my mind actually did break under the pressure of institutional confinement. Dr. Martinez made the decision I'd been hoping for within 20 minutes. "I think it would be best if we had you evaluated at the hospital," she said, already reaching for her phone to make arrangements. "This level of psychological distress requires specialized assessment and possibly adjusted medication protocols." 2 hours later, I was sitting in a real hospital room at General Medical Center, still wearing the facade of a woman teetering on the edge of complete psychological collapse, but internally celebrating the first successful step of my escape plan. The hospital environment was different in ways that went beyond just the medical equipment and professional atmosphere. Here, I was a patient with rights, rather than a resident subject to institutional control. Dr. Elizabeth Warren arrived that afternoon, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who introduced herself as a forensic psychiatrist, conducting an independent evaluation at the request of my legal representation. She spent 3 hours with me, conducting the kind of thorough mental status examination that should have been done before my original commitment. "Mrs. Reyes," she said after completing her assessment, "I need to tell you that your cognitive function, memory, and judgment all test within completely normal ranges for someone your age and educational background. There is absolutely no evidence of dementia, psychosis, or any condition that would justify the kind of guardianship arrangement you've been subject to." The words hit me like sunlight after months in a cave. To hear a qualified professional confirm what I'd known all along, that my mind was sound, my judgment intact, my commitment unlawful, felt like being handed back my identity after watching it be systematically dismantled. "What happens now?" I asked, Now we document everything. The flawed evaluation process, the questionable medications, the financial irregularities your attorney has uncovered. This is going to court, Mrs. Reyes. And when it does, the people responsible for this travesty are going to face serious consequences. That evening, Lucas received a phone call that shattered his carefully constructed world. Morrison had filed an emergency petition to dissolve the guardianship, accompanied by Dr. Warren's evaluation and a detailed accounting of every financial transaction Lucas had made since gaining control of my affairs. The documents painted a picture of systematic theft disguised as concerned family care. Lucas arrived at the hospital at 9:30 p.m., accompanied by Crystal and the same sharp-dressed attorney who'd helped him destroy my life 6 months earlier. But the balance of power had shifted completely. Instead of facing a confused, medicated woman in an institutional setting, they found me sitting in a hospital bed surrounded by legal documents and supported by professionals who'd confirmed my competency. "Mom, what's going on?" Lucas asked, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "Dr. Martinez said you had some kind of breakdown and needed emergency evaluation." "I had the evaluation," I replied calmly. "It turns out I'm perfectly sane. It also turns out that you and Crystal have been stealing from me for months while claiming to act in my best interests." Crystal stepped forward with the aggressive posture of someone accustomed to intimidating opposition into submission. "This is ridiculous. You were declared incompetent by qualified professionals. You can't just decide you're competent because you don't like the consequences." "You're right," I agreed. "I can't just decide, but qualified professionals can evaluate me properly," which apparently never happened the first time. "Dr. Warren, would you like to explain to my son what you discovered during your assessment?" Dr. Warren's clinical summary was devastating in its precision. She detailed the procedural violations in my original evaluation, the inappropriate medication regimen that had been used to suppress rather than treat, and the complete absence of evidence for any cognitive impairment. She explained that my commitment had been based on hearsay and financial motivation rather than medical necessity. Furthermore, Dr. Warren continued, the financial records provided by Mrs. Reyes's attorney suggests that this guardianship was established and maintained for the purpose of facilitating theft, not protecting a vulnerable individual. Lucas's attorney tried to interrupt, but Morrison was ready with documents that demolished every argument before it could be fully formed. Bank records showing the discrepancies in reported sale prices, business filings revealing payments to Crystal's consulting company for services that had never been provided. Asset transfers that violated the terms of Roberto's trust in ways that triggered automatic legal penalties. Your client has been operating under a guardianship that was fraudulently obtained, Morrison told Lucas's lawyer. Every financial transaction he's conducted is subject to reversal, and both he and Ms. Crystal face potential criminal charges for elder abuse and financial exploitation. I watched my son's face as the magnitude of his situation became clear. The confident man who'd walked into the hospital expecting to deal with another of his mother's episodes was rapidly transforming into someone who understood that his carefully planned theft had just collapsed around him. But she was really confused, Lucas said weakly. She was having memory problems, making poor decisions. Crystal was just trying to help organize things. Crystal was trying to steal everything my husband left me, I said, my voice steady and clear. And you helped her do it because you thought I was too weak to fight back. Mom, please, we can work this out. If there were mistakes made— Mistakes? I interrupted. You had me declared mentally incompetent based on lies. You sold my house without my knowledge. You auctioned off your father's tools to strangers. You locked me in an institution and medicated me into submission so you could steal my inheritance without interference. Those weren't mistakes, Lucas. Those were crimes. Crystal made one last attempt to regain control of the situation. This is all very convenient. You have a breakdown, get taken to a hospital, and suddenly you're competent again? How does that work exactly? Dr. Warren answered before I could. It works because Mrs. Reyes was never incompetent in the first place. She was the victim of a fraudulent guardianship established through falsified medical evidence. The breakdown you're referring to was actually an appropriate psychological response to discovering that her roommate at the facility had suffered a medical emergency. Any rational person would be distressed under those circumstances. The room fell silent as the weight of Dr. Warren's words settled over everyone present. Lucas and Crystal's elaborate scheme had been exposed and documented by professionals whose credentials couldn't be questioned or dismissed. The legal machinery they'd used to destroy my life was now turning against them with ruthless efficiency. "What do you want?" Lucas asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I want my life back," I said. "My house, my assets, my dignity, and my freedom. I want every dollar you stole returned with interest. I want you to face the consequences of what you've done to me. And if we fight this in court?" Morrison smiled with the satisfaction of someone who'd been preparing for exactly this question. "Then the criminal charges will be filed immediately, and everything becomes a matter of public record. Your reputations, your employment prospects, your freedom, all of it becomes subject to public scrutiny and criminal investigation." I looked at my son, this stranger who wore the face of the child I'd raised and loved, and felt something inside me settle into place. Not forgiveness, not yet, but a kind of peaceful finality. "I gave you everything I had for 38 years, I told him. "My youth, my dreams, my devotion, my trust. And you threw it all away for money, and a woman who convinced you that your mother was disposable." Lucas started to speak, but I held up my hand to stop him. "I'm not finished. You're going to sign documents returning every asset you've stolen. You're going to pay for Mrs. Chen's medical bills since her emergency was part of exposing your fraud. And then you're going to walk out of my life and never contact me again. Mom, I'm not your mother anymore. I stopped being your mother the day you decided I was worth more to you dead than alive." The silence that followed was the sound of a relationship dying, finally and completely. 3 months later, I stood in the living room of my reclaimed house, watching movers carry the last of my husband's tools back into his workshop. Every wrench, every saw, every carefully organized box of screws and bolts had been tracked down and returned, sometimes at considerable expense to Lucas and Crystal, who'd discovered that stealing from a trust designed by a meticulous man came with financial penalties that compounded daily. The house looked different now, not because anything had changed physically, but because I saw it through different eyes. These walls had witnessed my destruction and my resurrection. This kitchen had been where I received the voicemail that shattered my world, and now it was where I brewed coffee for Mrs. Chen, who'd become my closest friend and confidant since our shared escape from Sunny Meadows. "How do you feel?" she asked, settling into the chair by the window where she could watch the neighborhood wake up. At 78, she'd proven more resilient than anyone had imagined, not only surviving her calculated overdose, but using the hospital stay to expose the financial abuse she'd suffered at her daughter's hands. Like me, she'd reclaimed her independence and her assets through legal channels that had left her family facing serious consequences. "Different," I admitted, pouring coffee into mugs that had once belonged to strangers who'd bought my possessions at Crystal's estate sale. Morrison had insisted on recovering everything possible, down to my grandmother's china and the photo albums I'd thought were lost forever. Stronger, but not in the way I expected. The strength I'd found wasn't the aggressive power of revenge or the bitter satisfaction of watching enemies suffer. It was something quieter and more profound, the deep peace that comes from surviving betrayal and discovering that your core self remains intact, despite everything others try to take from you. Lucas had signed every document Morrison placed before him, returning assets worth nearly $400,000 that he and Crystal had systematically stolen over 6 months. The house sale had been reversed through legal channels that left the innocent buyers compensated, but Lucas responsible for all associated costs. Crystal's consulting business had been revealed as a shell company designed to launder stolen assets, and both she and Lucas now faced civil and criminal penalties that would follow them for years. But the real victory hadn't been financial. It had been the moment in that hospital room when I looked my son in the eye and refused to be diminished by his betrayal. For 38 years, I'd defined myself through my relationships: wife, mother, caregiver, supporter. Lucas's cruelty had forced me to discover who I was when all those roles were stripped away, and the woman I'd found was someone I could respect. "Have you heard from him?" Mrs. Chen asked, though we both knew she meant Lucas. "No, and I don't expect to." I settled into my own chair, the one Roberto and I had chosen together 20 years ago, now returned to its proper place beside the window. Morrison says he's moved to another state with Crystal. Apparently, her influence over him was strong enough to survive legal exposure and financial ruin. The irony wasn't lost on me. Lucas had chosen the woman who'd manipulated him into betraying his mother over the family relationships that had sustained him his entire life. Crystal had proven more important to him than his heritage, his integrity, or his mother's love. In trying to claim everything, he'd lost the only things that actually mattered. Dr. Warren had explained during one of our follow-up sessions that children who turn against their parents in this way often suffer from what she called moral injury, a deep psychological wound that occurs when someone violates their own fundamental values. Lucas would have to live with the knowledge that he'd imprisoned and stolen from the woman who'd sacrificed everything for his welfare. That burden, she suggested, might prove heavier than any legal penalty. I'd found I could think about Lucas now without the crushing pain that had characterized my early months at Sunny Meadows. The grief was still there, but it was clean grief, mourning for the son I'd thought I had, rather than anger at the man he'd actually become. I could remember his childhood with fondness while accepting that the adult he'd chosen to be was a stranger who'd simply worn my son's face while planning my destruction. The most unexpected gift of my ordeal had been the community I'd discovered among other women who'd survived similar betrayals. Mrs. Chen introduced me to a network of elderly women who'd been targeted by adult children seeking to claim inheritances prematurely. We met monthly at the community center, sharing stories and strategies, offering support to those still fighting for their freedom and celebrating victories when they came. Margaret Willis, whose son had attempted to have her declared incompetent so he could sell her house to pay gambling debts. Dorothy Santos, whose daughter had systematically drained her accounts while claiming to be helping with financial management. Ruth Patterson, Mrs. Patterson's sister-in-law, whose grandson had forged documents to gain access to her retirement savings. These women had taught me that my experience, while devastating, wasn't unique. Elder abuse by family members had become an epidemic, enabled by legal systems that prioritized expedience over justice and social attitudes that viewed aging women as burdens rather than people deserving protection and respect. The hardest part, Margaret said during one of our meetings, isn't losing the money or even the house. It's realizing that someone you loved never actually saw you as a person worth protecting. But we'd also learned that survival was possible, that dignity could be reclaimed, and that women who'd been written off as powerless could fight back with devastating effectiveness when they finally decided to stop accepting unacceptable treatment. I'd used some of my recovered assets to fund a legal defense fund for other women fighting guardianship abuse. Morrison had helped me establish a foundation that provided resources for people who couldn't afford the kind of legal representation that had saved me. Roberto's careful planning had given me not just the tools to reclaim my own life, but the means to help others do the same. 6 months after my release from Sunny Meadows, I received a letter from Dr. Martinez expressing regret about my treatment at the facility. She'd been conducting her own investigation into the institutional practices that had enabled my imprisonment, and several policy changes had been implemented to prevent similar abuses. It wasn't an apology. Institutional liability concerns prevented that, but it was acknowledgement that what had happened to me was wrong. I'd written back, not with forgiveness, but with information about the legal resources available to other residents who might be questioning their own commitments. Change, I'd learned, happened one case at a time, one woman at a time, one moment of courage at a time. Standing in my reclaimed living room, surrounded by recovered possessions and filled with hard-won wisdom, I thought about the woman I'd been before Lucas's betrayal. She'd been kind but naive, generous but unprotected, loving but unprepared for the reality that love wasn't always returned in equal measure. The woman I was now had learned to love herself enough to demand better treatment from others. She'd learned that setting boundaries wasn't cruelty but wisdom, that protecting herself wasn't selfishness but necessity. She'd learned that true strength sometimes looked like sitting quietly in an institutional bed while secretly planning revolution. Mrs. Chen raised her coffee mug in a toast to surviving everything they tried to do to us. I raised my own mug, thinking about Roberto and the protection he'd built around my future, about Mrs. Patterson and the evidence she'd gathered while I thought I was alone, about all the women who'd fought similar battles and won, to discovering we were stronger than anyone realized, I replied, including ourselves. Outside my window, the neighborhood was coming alive with the sounds of ordinary life, children walking to school, cars starting in driveways, neighbors calling greetings across yard fences. I was part of that ordinary life again, no longer an exile from the world of free people making their own choices about their own lives. I'd learned that sometimes the most powerful victory isn't defeating your enemies, it's refusing to let them define who you are. Lucas and Crystal had tried to reduce me to a collection of symptoms and deficits, a problem to be managed rather than a person to be respected. Their failure wasn't just legal or financial, it was fundamental. They'd forgotten that behind every elderly woman they saw as vulnerable and disposable was a lifetime of experience, wisdom, and strength that couldn't be stolen or medicated away. They'd forgotten that love, when betrayed, doesn't always transform into weakness. Sometimes it transforms into something much more dangerous to those who've counted on that weakness. They'd forgotten that my husband had loved me enough to protect me even from threats he couldn't have imagined, and that protection extended far beyond the grave. Most importantly, they'd forgotten that a woman who's lost everything except her dignity has nothing left to lose, and therefore nothing to fear. I sipped my coffee and smiled, watching the sun rise over a neighborhood where I belonged, in a house that was truly mine, surrounded by friendships I'd earned through shared struggle and mutual respect. Some people spend their whole lives waiting for justice. I'd learned to create my own, and that, I realized, was the most valuable lesson of all.